Hello, Namaste. Welcome to Dave's Hammer Show. This is the weekly flagship program of Indigenous television, in which I sometimes do a face-to-face interview and sometimes I do online video conferences and discuss on various contemporary issues that Indigenous peoples are facing. And I try to bring the scholars from different countries and basically bring their voices as well as the struggles and lessons, and try to connect with one another. Uh, in these connections today, I have invited very important guests who, even though comes from India, his name is Ramnath Bhat, and currently he is doing his PhD in from the London Schools of Economics, if I'm not mistaken, and he did his master's in communications and media development, and his dissertation was about the participation issues in general. And he's doing his PhD in the infrastructure, currently from the School of London Schools of Economics. And today I'm going to discuss about the same issue, mostly the community radio's role and the challenges of minority people in terms of participations and inclusion. As why I'm going to discuss is, besides his studies, he works, or he's the current president of AMARC. And AMARC, which is an umbrella organization of community radio broadcasters from around the world, and he is leading the AMARC Asia Pacific. So first of all, let me welcome him in my show. So welcome to the show, first of all.
Thanks for having me.
So as I introduce you in short, but could you just elaborate? I mean, could you just introduce yourself in an elaborative way, as in terms of, I mean, relating with media and your work?
Sure. I started my career in community broadcasting in 2004. And I was involved in the setting up of a community radio station in South India. And I was living in that village, working with the community. Just after college, I did my undergraduate in media studies. And after that, I straight away started working at a community radio station. And for 4 years, I was on the ground working with community broadcasting on the technical and the program side. And in those 4 years, I helped set up many community radio stations in India, some on very specific, for example, disaster-related community radios. And by 2009-10, I started also getting involved in the policy issues. And I worked with many organizations, national and international organizations. And I was also consulting with the government of India on a range of policy issues, going from community radio but also telecom and spectrum allocation issues. And in 2008, I, along with a few colleagues, started a small media and arts organization called MARA, and we all continued working in community broadcasting. And in 2014, I decided to do a master's at the London School of Economics, and because of my long career in community broadcasting, I was very interested in how to understand and how to theorize participation, the concept of participation. And so that's what I did my master's, and in 2016 I started doing my PhD also at the London School of Economics. And my PhD is more broad in terms of communication infrastructure and how communication infrastructure has an impact. And my research actually was in the state of Chhattisgarh, which has one of the highest population of indigenous people in India, almost 40%. So I did my research there, field work there. And now I'm in the end of the PhD, and hopefully I will submit the PhD next year.
We're really happy. I'm really happy to have you in my show, and I would like to know, as you are the president of AMARC Asia Pacific, and many of my viewers, our viewers, are not aware about the AMARC. What is it all about? What it works? How it works?
Yeah,
right? Could you just tell me a little bit about the AMARC in general and AMARC
sure,
Asia
sure.
Pacific? And
So, AMARC is a French acronym, and in English it stands for the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters. And we have thousands of radios across the world as our members. It's a membership driven organization, and it was started in the mid 1980s by activists. And in the 1980s, there was a strong movement for communication rights because people started realizing that unless you have a voice, you can't fight for other rights. So, representation and communication rights were perceived to be very important. So, many activists from around the world decided to start a network organization, a member driven organization. And because it started in Montreal, in Canada, which is a French speaking region. So already there was the experience of being a minority language region in an English speaking country. So they were very clear about communication rights and language rights. And they started the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters. And in the coming decades, community radio has grown to a remarkable degree. And over the years, the World Association has now got regional chapters. So we have a chapter in Africa, we have a chapter in Asia Pacific, we have a chapter in Latin America and Caribbean, we have a chapter in North America, and we have a chapter in Europe. And we might start a chapter very soon for Middle East and North Africa, right? So now I have been involved with Asia Pacific community radios from a very long time, from the beginning of my career. And over the last 6 years, I have been the president of the Asia Pacific chapter of the AMARC. And what we do is that we have various thematic priorities which are decided in consultation with the members. So every 4 years we have a regional assembly where we invite our member broadcasters to attend, and we have detailed consultations and meetings and workshops where the members can tell us what they think should be the priority of the organization. And depending on what the members feel, the board decides to take it up on behalf of the members. So in the recent years, the disaster risk reduction, disaster management has been a very important theme because of disasters in Nepal, the earthquake, but also the nuclear related disasters in Japan, the tsunami in India, and the flooding in Bangladesh. Across the region we have faced disasters, so that has become a very important theme. Conflict is a very important theme for various reasons, because of religious fundamentalism or because of cross-border conflict, because of all kinds of conflict. That has also become a very important theme. The empowerment of women and the sexual minorities, the protection and promotion of indigenous communities and minority communities is also a very important theme. So there are several themes that have become very important for us as a network, and these have come through the contribution of our members who tell us that this is what we should focus on.
so in this recent conversation, just you mentioned about the right to information, or right to the communication right, basically. When we talk about indigenous people's right to information or communications, we basically say that right to information, which is one of the human rights, but for indigenous people's right to information alone is not sufficient, which is not sufficient, right? Right to information in the language that they speak and understand, right? We basically advocate on that one. And what is your say on this, right? For indigenous peoples to exercise this right?
So from AMARC's point of view, we have always believed that right to information is only one half of the bargain. The other half should be the right to communicate. But even if you have the right to information and the right to communication, there are more factors that AMARC pays attention to, and that is the communities who is getting the information and who is having the right to communication should have the means of production. So they should have the ownership over the means of production of information. And when communities have the ownership over the means of production, then they will decide to broadcast it in the language that they want, at the time that they want, on the issues that they want. And in a general situation, whether it's in any society, whether it's at the regional level or national level, international level, right to communication doesn't occur in a vacuum. Right to communication has to be seen in the context of existing inequality. And if you look at the inequality, there are communities who have not historically not had the right to communicate. So AMARC strongly believes in standing up for the right to communicate for communities who have not had historically the right to communicate. So this specifically includes minorities of all kinds: religious minority, indigenous communities, and sexual minorities. So we are especially interested in promoting their right to communication. And this will happen through the full right to communicate in the languages that they want to communicate in.
So when we talk about the right to communications, and there is also several challenges that minority groups, or including indigenous peoples, women, and other Dalits, they are basically facing. And your PhD was about the participation as well. And as you are an expert, so when we talk about challenges in terms of participation, where do you see how they can be participated in the media?
I think the first thing is to create an enabling policy environment, because it is through the policy that the communication resources are controlled. Because in any country, resources like spectrum, resources like public money, taxes, these are all controlled by the government. And as minority communities or communities who have suffered historic injustice, they deserve a special access to those resources. And to get special access to those resources, there needs to be an enabling policy environment. So the first thing to do is to work with the government and to hold the elected representative accountable to ensure that communities who have faced historic injustice, communities who are minorities, deserve special protection and special access with communication resources. The second thing is to have dedicated resources for capacity building and to ensure that both the technical and the program side, minority communities can get access to the skill development, whether it's how to make programs but also how to manage media initiatives, how to get feedback, how to do research, all aspects of the media system. They need the capacity building. And the third is protection from the market. Usually the media market is dominated by the mainstream languages. So it is very hard for minority media to compete in a mainstream media market. So the government or the civil society should provide some way to protect the minority media through subsidies or through increased advertising or through some special mechanisms where the minority media can survive without having to compete with the mainstream dominant players. So these are the 3 or 4 broad steps that I think we need to take when speaking at a regional scale.
And one of the research that you conducted was ethnographic research in the media as well, right?
Yes.
So you told me that you did this research in India.
Yes.
So what was your finding on that ethnographic research? Is that in terms of challenges that minorities are facing,
Yes,
and
yes.
in terms of inclusion, participation in the media, or?
Yes, I found that in my research in Chhattisgarh, which is hosting a large amount of indigenous people, I found that most of the communication resources, communication policies are decided in Delhi by the central government. There is no consultation with the indigenous people who are living in Chhattisgarh or anywhere across the country. Everything is decided by central government. And the indigenous people, they don't have access to basic infrastructure. There is no electricity in many of the villages. But at the same time, the central government is thinking of giving them broadband access. But there is no meaning of giving broadband access if there is no electricity in the village. You see. The second thing is that there is no holistic approach to looking at empowerment of indigenous communities, because indigenous communities many times they would need they are under threat because of mining, because they are living on land which has huge amounts of coal, bauxite. So on one hand, the central government is saying we will provide communication and empowerment. On the other hand, they are saying we'll evict them because that land is very valuable resources, natural resources. So I think what is needed is that there is a needs to be a holistic approach with regard to indigenous community, where first of all their right to land has to be the most important right, that they are the owners of that land. Although it is there in the constitution, it is not being implemented in practice. The second thing is that the protection and promotion of the language is very important, because in these states uh, it is becoming very quickly dominated by Hindi or by Chhattisgarhi or by the state dominant language. So with the Adivasi community, each of the Adivasi groups have their own dialects and their languages, which are not actually recognized by the state. So these languages and dialects have to be recognized and protected, and resources have to be allocated so that these languages can flourish. They should not just exist in a museum, that they are living practices. So they need the resources for that. And communication resources comes last, you know, but there needs to be underlying more fundamental rights, especially the right to land.
So the example just you showed us that one size fits all, and
Yes,
the decision making at the center and implementing in all
yes,
across the country.
yes,
An example that you brought the case from Chhattisgarh, and
yes.
the situation is no different in Nepal and elsewhere, I guess. Or after being involved in AMARC, did you find some similar concept, similar situation in other part of the world as well, or one in India or in this part of the world, or
I think in large parts of the world this is the same situation, because indigenous people have been marginalized. And what has happened is that over the 18th and 19th century, in most parts of the world, the indigenous people have been treated as criminals by the colonizing powers, whether it is UK, the British Empire, or other colonizers like Spain or other countries. They always saw the indigenous people as backward, illiterate, ignorant, you know. And that attitude has persisted even in the modern age. And those who, many people still believe in those stereotypes that the indigenous people are backward. It is only in very few places that there is slowly now a movement to reclaim the rights and to educate the wider society about how not to have the stereotypes about the indigenous people. So it will take time, because indigenous people also are a minority. They are not big in numbers. So I think there has to be a more effort to collaborate between countries. So indigenous people, if they get together between countries, the movement can be much stronger.
so in this relations, where do you see the role? Whenever you basically said about the language and culture, and community radio is said to be, which played an eminent role basically to keep their language alive as well as culture, right? So, if you have to say, or to the point, and what role basically a community radio can play to revive or revitalize or keep, continue the indigenous language and culture and all.
I think the first thing AMARC can do is to work with indigenous groups in various countries to help them make a special place in the media policy environment. There needs to be special protection of spectrum for indigenous community broadcasting. The second thing is we would like to work with developing the skills and doing capacity building, and providing technical support and programmatic support for indigenous broadcasters in every country. And the third is that we would like to facilitate cross sharing of resources and knowledge between indigenous groups in different countries who are members of AMAC. So if there are indigenous groups in India, in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Myanmar, in different countries, how they can be in touch with each other and how AMARC can facilitate that. That will also be our priority.
The policy, in
Yes.
terms of language policy or education policy. In terms of policy, I guess I'm not that much aware in India, but in Nepal, in terms of policy, we have good policy. The constitution has guaranteed right to education in mother tongue. So in terms of information, right to information is there in mother tongue. But in practice, we hardly can see that, policy being implemented. How do you see this? In policy wise, there is good, but in practice, there is difficult, there is challenge.
I think in most parts, at least for example in Bangladesh or India or Nepal, we have good constitutional provisions. We have recognized the importance of the indigenous people. But policy is different from constitutional provision. Policy making has been largely opaque. It has not been consultative. And it is not taking into account the need to create special provisions for minority groups. It is the one size fits all approach. And in the policy environment, we need to create pressure group. So the best thing to do would be to see how, you mentioned earlier that there is an indigenous broadcasting radio group which has about 20 stations, radio stations. This is the perfect time for that group to start putting pressure on the government, because many media policies are right now at the stage of the bill, and in 2020 it might become an act. So before the bill becomes an act, the indigenous groups have to put pressure on the government to put forward their needs and their demands. And groups like AMARC would be very happy to work with the indigenous groups to see how the policy provisions can be made. These policy provisions can be reservation of frequency for indigenous groups in different districts, acknowledgement that there are distinct indigenous languages that are spoken, and the need to provide resources in community broadcasting to protect and promote those languages, and also the need for dedication of resources for capacity building of indigenous communities. So these things should be in the policy, and we need the pressure group to talk to the government to ensure that these policies with respect to indigenous communities are there.
So when we talk about indigenous people's right to information or media, we have, indigenous peoples have, international law has guaranteed their right to media, right? We have, UN has UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Article 16 basically says that guarantees right to indigenous people's right to media in the language that they speak and understand. And if we focus in the Asian Pacific, I guess Australia comes to the first, and in South Asia, even Nepal. In terms of accessing frequencies, it has been very easy, right? But sustaining is another question again. But how do you see the indigenous people's access to the media at such, right, in other part of the countries, including in India, as I traveled in different part of India, and it was really difficult for indigenous peoples even to access licenses and all, right?
In India, it's a very bad situation because since the last 20 to 30 years, especially in the central Indian region, in the states of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand and Odisha, for example, the government thinks that all indigenous people are Maoist. And also the state, in collaboration with the big mining companies, has actually started to evict a lot of indigenous communities because they want to access the coal, the bauxite, the iron ore, these kind of natural resources, which is huge money for the corporate sector and for the state. So any resistance by the indigenous community is seen as the Maoism. So every time an indigenous community from these regions apply for a community radio license, it is rejected on security grounds, that they are a potential security threat. So while on paper there is a provision for indigenous communities to apply for the license, in practice they are seen as a security threat. So in India, I think the situation is bad. Right now, if you see in India, also in the northeastern part of the country, there are protests everywhere against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Registry of Citizens. Again, I fear that the government will view the indigenous communities of the Northeast with suspicion, that they are a security threat. So first, I think there has to be an acknowledgement that indigenous communities are not marginal. They are not a security threat. They are the oldest communities who have inhabited the earth, in that part of the earth, and they are the owners of that land, and they have rights to that land, and the government should, acknowledge that. And then the communication right will only flow from that. It cannot precede this.
So, in terms of acknowledgement, as you said, that the good thing is, or good side is, that indigenous peoples are knowledge holders. It is basically said that they are knowledge holders, and they have been guardians to protect the forest and the, all sort of, even climate change, challenges they are just not only facing, but they are using their knowledge to, to cope up with the climate change and all. So a lot of biodiversities which are basically protected in the indigenous peoples areas, and they are guardians of language and cultures, rituals, whatever you say. But the countries are not looking those their cultural language, their knowledge as a treasure, right? And how do you see this one? And what do you see the solutions here?
I think there is a arrogance in modern civilization that what we call science is the truth, and everything else is either backward or not good enough. And I would add that indigenous societies not only have excellent ways of looking at the environment and biodiversity, not only are they guardians of culture and languages, but they're also excellent models for looking at gender relations, looking at property rights, and very little violence actually around land or gender violence. So there is much to learn from actually indigenous communities. And I think there is a lot of scope for work, for media actually, for indigenous media and also other media, to take indigenous knowledge very seriously. And I think it is happening in pockets. Um, there is a little bit of work, but we just need to amplify that. And this will be done through good old fashioned field work. Media practitioners have to go to the indigenous communities, talk to the people, get the knowledge, and we need the intermediary people who can see the value in that, who can be translators, who can talk to the indigenous people but also translate it, and how science, or those who see it as science, can understand the value of it. So we need those intermediary people also who can help.
But the term, the community media or community radios, they are supposed to do or supposed to play this role, right?
Yes.
But do you see the community radios as such, which are located in community areas, are playing this sort of role?
Yes and no. I would say it depends on the country. From country to country, it's quite different. For example, in Australia, there's a healthy track record. In New Zealand, there's a healthy track record. Countries in the South Asian part, I don't think there is a very healthy track record. But this just means that it is more work for us. Networks like AMARC, we really want to promote indigenous knowledge and connect it to both disaster and climate change, disaster risk reduction, management and climate change. And we want indigenous knowledge to take the lead in this. And we want other community radio stations who are not focusing on indigenous issues to learn from indigenous knowledge. And I think this is something that AMARC can do. For I think community radio, like any other media, it can be extremely localized and can only be focusing on the community. So sometimes, it is up the job of networks like AMARC to bring experiences from outside.
So we have come almost at the end of the show, and we have touched many issues, including right to communications and challenges that indigenous peoples are facing, including about the policies and all. At last, if you have anything to add on that, something that I haven't asked or guided you to talk and that you want to say.
And just a small addition, in addition to what we have spoken, I think as the times move, community broadcasting, whether it's indigenous broadcasting or whether it's television or radio, I think the technological forms are changing. This is the age of digital media. And in that digital media, there is a monopoly by American companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon. So in that environment, it's very difficult. Unlike governments, you cannot hold private companies accountable. You cannot demand for space. So in the digital age and in the internet age, I think we have to think very carefully about how minority voices will be represented. What kind of ownership of the technologies and of the spectrum and of the media space can minority communities reclaim when most of it is owned in private hands and there's no elected representative from whom you can claim it? So these are the new challenges, I think, of the 21st century. And I think minority communities, especially more than anyone else, we have to brainstorm and lobby for digital rights. And that will, I think, will be a very important agenda, not just in Nepal, but across the region.
Thank you so much, Ram, for your esteemed thought and
you.
time. Despite your busy schedule, you managed to come to the
My pleasure,
studio.
my pleasure.
So we have come to the end of the show. If you have any queries or feedbacks regarding the show, you can reach me at indigenous-television@gmail.com. And next week I will come with a new guest to discuss on a different topic. Till then, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.